everybody. Hope you're all having a good week. This week we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, but I want to cover just a couple of housekeeping items before I get started. First of all, if you have any drafts of the paper, if your second paper that you want to get to me, please turn those in as soon as possible, or at least get them to me as soon as possible so I have a chance to really properly go over them and get notes back to you. Also, as far as your participation grades go, I'm judging your participation based on your discussion board posts. So obviously if you're not posting on the discussion board, then it's going to negatively affect your participation grade. If you are posting but not responding, you'll get a participation grade. It just won't be as high as those who are actively participating in the discussion board posts. So just wanted to go over that real quick. If you have any questions about your grade, just shoot me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So this week, like I said, we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, and we're going to do a little bit of review first because we talked about Vietnam some in week 4 when we talked about Asian revolutions. So if you look at the cover of the PowerPoint presentation this week, there's a crash course video. You've seen part of it. Hopefully you've seen part of it. The first part's on Korea. The second part is on Vietnam. So you can skip over the Korea part and go straight to where John Green's talking about Vietnam. The second slide, or slide 1, is a map of Vietnam, although you should be able to remember where Vietnam is, but you should remember that from your quiz. And then on slide 2 is kind of a review of what we went over in week 4. That Vietnam started out as French Indochina is now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And it goes back to the 19th century. We'll go back to the 19th century when those 3 countries faced French intruders. And the French wanted to promote and protect Catholic missionaries. Catholicism is going to play an important role in this in a minute. Expand trade into China, increase national prestige. By the 1880s, France had imposed direct rule over what's now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And by the 1890s, the French had crushed all armed resistance. The August Revolution happened in 1945, where you have Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh forces march into Hanoi and establish an independent Vietnamese state. They were willing to negotiate with the French, but the French were having none of it, and we have the First Indochina War, which is the beginning of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, where we come in support of the French. Truman administration commits substantial military aid to French forces in order for the French to keep their imperial holdings in French Indochina. And in 1961, by 1956, Vietnam has been split along the 17th parallel, communist North Vietnam, and not communist South Vietnam. And so by 1961, JFK has increased aid to South Vietnam. So, like I said, if you have any questions about that, just go back to week 4. But I want to go over some of the important players in the Vietnam War first. So if you go to slide 3, you see Ho Chi Minh. There is an article about Ho Chi Minh and a link to it on the slide. As we said a few weeks ago, he studied in Paris. He was at the meeting, he was at the Paris Peace Conference, at the end of World War I, and was pretty much ignored by the participants. And in 1920s, he becomes a communist, moves to Moscow, part of the Indochina communist movement, returns to Vietnam in 1941 as a leader of the Viet Minh, which is short for Vietnamese Independence League. It's anti-French, anti-Japanese nationalist organization. The August Revolution in 1945, and once again, moderation did not work. So Ho Chi Minh was successful. The communists in Vietnam were successful at attracting the peasantry into their resistance. Vietnam is a very rural country, and it has a lot of parallels to Chinese communism. It was based in rural areas. If you go to slide 4, and this is a warning, I am going to slaughter names. I do not speak Vietnamese at all. You have Nguyen Thai Dien, and she is important because she illustrates the role of peasant women in Vietnam. She was a communist and an activist, and women were key in the Vietnam War. They were called long-haired warriors, and they carried out tasks that might look suspicious if the men were doing it, such as visiting relatives in jail, carrying messages, distributing propaganda, spying for guerrilla units. She fought with the Vietnam forces against the French in her teens, and she was a founding member of the National Liberation Front, and became an official within the National Liberation Front. In 1965, she also became chair of the South Vietnam Women's Liberation Association, and which was a political organization. And so she held the highest ranking combat position held by a woman during the war. And so I just want to illustrate her because we don't see a whole lot of women in the Vietnam War. And so she's an example of a woman who was really actively participating in the war. And there's a link to an article on her. And then on slide 5, you have I'm not going to try to pronounce the name. You have the leader of South Vietnam, and he was a staunch anti-communist and nationalistic Catholic. So he was born in Vietnam. He enrolled in the School of Public Administration in Hanoi, which was a French school that prepared young Vietnamese to serve in the French colonial administration. So he worked for the French government in Vietnam. Although the French were pretty irritated by him, he frequently made calls for the French to grant Vietnam more independence. And during the First Indochina War, people like Diem, I think that's how I pronounce his last name, anti-communists like him really faced a dilemma. They did not want to restore colonial power to the French. They wanted self-determination for Vietnam, but they didn't want to support the communist Viet Minh. So he proclaims his neutrality and it tries to establish a third movement that was both anti-colonial and anti-communist. And he also secretly maintained contact with high-ranking leaders of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was the government established by Ho Chi Minh. And he attempted he attempted to woo high-ranking officials away from Ho Chi Minh's government and to join him. And at the same time, he was lobbying French colonial officials for a true independence of Vietnam. So by 1950, the Viet Minh has lost patience with him and sentences him to death. And the French aren't protecting him because they're irritated with him too. So he decides to leave Vietnam in 1950 and is in exile for 4 years. He returns in 1954 after the Geneva Accords partitioned Vietnam along the 17th parallel. And he becomes the prime minister of South Vietnam and immediately faces a lot of problems. He initially crushed communist sympathizers in South Vietnam. He was also, because of his Catholic beliefs, Buddhists were very resentful of him, and he allegedly persecuted and had a lot of Buddhists killed. The U.S. was pretty critical of his government. He wasn't running it exactly the way the U.S. wanted him to, at a time when the U.S. is giving him a lot of aid. He was giving a lot of political power to family members and associates, and that combined with the Buddhist crisis, Americans sponsored or approved a coup. And so he was overthrown and eventually assassinated. And after his assassination, South Vietnam was unable to establish a stable government, and several coups took place following. And so while the United States continued to influence South Vietnam's government, the assassination really bolstered North Vietnam and their attempts to characterize South Vietnam as a supporter of colonialism or kind of a puppet state. So that's where we are when things really start to escalate with the Vietnam War. If you go to slide 6, you have President Johnson. And he was actually the fourth president who was involved in the Vietnam conflict. But he becomes president in November of 1963 after JFK's assassination. And he kept a lot of the Kennedy rank and file on his cabinet, notably Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. And Vietnam, by the time Johnson took over, Vietnam was, on his desk from day one because JFK had sanctioned the assassination of the South Vietnamese prime minister at that point and had given substantially more aid to South Vietnam. And this is, we're at probably the apex of the Cold War, where we've just had the botched Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so this fear that if South Vietnam falls to communism, that there's going to be a domino effect, that the whole rest of the region is going to fall to communism. And so when Johnson takes the presidency, he has this sitting on his desk from day one. And it was a deteriorating situation already. And there was very little room for maneuver. And he also believed that we needed to defend South Vietnam, that communist aggression had to be stopped. And so if you go to slide 7, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in August of 1964, some North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the USS Maddox, which was in the Gulf of Tonkin. The USS Turner Joy heads towards the Maddox for backup. By the time it arrives, the torpedoes are gone. Their torpedo boats, the Vietnamese torpedo boats, are no longer in the area. And 2 days later, there were radar echoes that appear in the Turner Joy's radar, which mistakenly, and I don't know the kind of technology, but there were radar echoes where they mistakenly thought that they were under attack when they weren't. So Johnson responds by launching U.S. aircraft on a retaliatory raid. Johnson interrupted TV to make an announcement in which he described an attack by North Vietnam on 2 USS Navy warships, and his speech kind of repeated that theme that kind of dramatized the Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi as the aggressor and puts the U.S. in a defensive position. And Johnson also referred to the attacks as having taken place on the high seas, suggesting that they had occurred in international waters when they did not. And they were still gathering evidence on what exactly happened by the time Johnson gives his speech on national television. And messages recorded that day indicate that neither Johnson nor Secretary McNamara was really certain if there was an attack at all. McNamara failed to inform Johnson that the U.S. Naval Task Group commander had changed his mind, had said, there probably wasn't actually a torpedo attack. So McNamara did not immediately call Johnson to tell him. And so had Johnson really had all the information, he might not have chosen to escalate the situation as much as he did. But after what they believed was an attack on U.S. warships, Johnson asked Congress for authorization for the U.S. military to defend the region, and Congress complied in what was an almost unanimous vote, what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution granted Johnson the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be jeopardized by communist aggression. And it served as Johnson's legal justification for deploying U.S. conventional forces and going into open warfare against North Vietnam. So Johnson comes in and the war escalates exponentially. Of course, in 2005, the Tongan study was declassified, and it concluded that the Maddox had actually engaged the North Vietnamese, but that there were no North Vietnamese naval vessels present during with the Turner Joy a couple of days later. So we really we escalate the situation in Vietnam really over false pretenses. So if you go to slide 8, escalation, at the time of JFK's assassination in 1963, there were approximately 16,000 American military personnel in Vietnam. And by the end of 1964, there were about 23,000. So throughout the fall and winter of 1964, the Johnson administration is kind of hemming and hawing and debating the correct strategy for Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to expand the war. Others wanted to apply gradual pressure to the Communist Party with limited and selective bombings. So in early 1965, North Vietnam attacked 2 U.S. Army installations in South Vietnam. And as a result, Johnson orders a significant bombing over North Vietnam and ends up going with the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommendation that we go kind of all in and sustained attacks on North Vietnam start. One of those being Operation Rolling Thunder, and they were American bombing raids on North Vietnam beginning in February of 1965, and they pretty much go on for about 3 years. And in March of 1965, Johnson sends the first combat troops to Vietnam. North Vietnam plan was to get the U.S. kind of bogged down in a war it couldn't win and create unfavorable conditions, political and military-wise, for North Vietnam to win. The communists believed that they could, if the war was extended as long as possible, that they would win, because the U.S. didn't really have any clearly defined objectives except, beat communism. And so by 1965, you have the Marines in Da Nang, the first American combat troops, arrive in Vietnam to defend an airfield at Da Nang. You have the first conventional battle in the Vietnam War takes place with American forces versus North Vietnamese forces in the Ai Drang Valley. And in 1966, B-52s bombed North Vietnam. And in 1967, you have, in a major ground war effort, you have Operation Cedar Falls, where about 16,000 U.S. troops and 14,000 South Vietnamese troops set out to destroy Viet Cong operations and supply units near Saigon. And so those are kind of the big, I'm not a military historian, so those are kind of the big events during the course of the rest of Johnson's administration. If you go to slide 9, that is a picture of a helicopter dropping Agent Orange. Herbicides and defoliants were used by the U.S. military as part of its warfare program from 1961 to 1971. So basically, the U.S. military sprays about 20 million gallons of this herbicide, Agent Orange, over Vietnam, because Vietnam was so heavily forested, and it was designed to kill all of the heavy forestation so they could see hiding spots of the North Vietnamese. Overall, more than 20% of South Vietnam's forests were also sprayed at least once over a 9-year period. The government of Vietnam has now said that more than 4 million of its citizens were exposed to Agent Orange, and as many as 3 million have suffered illnesses because of it, including birth defects, lymphoma, Parkinson's disease. Additionally, U.S. soldiers who were exposed to Agent Orange also now, my uncle is one of them, my mom's older brother, was exposed to Agent Orange, and now they attribute his Parkinson's disease to Agent Orange exposure. So now you have U.S. veterans who are starting to exhibit symptoms of exposure. So if you go to slide 10, in the Tet Offensive, in late January of 1968, the North Vietnam launched attacks against major South Vietnamese cities. And it catches the U.S. military off guard. The North Vietnamese kind of come in and take several key cities, including its capital, Saigon. One of the major battles, and there's a link to it on the slide, a story about it, was called the Battle of Hue, Battle for Hue, which lasted 26 days as U.S. and South Vietnamese troops try and recapture the city, which had been seized by the North Vietnamese. Hue had been a religious retreat in the middle of a war zone, but after this battle, it's nearly leveled, and almost all of its population becomes homeless. The U.S. wins, but it was not it was a military victory, but not a political or moral victory, or it was horrible for morale. And these attacks were known as the Tet Offensive. And they were designed to, the North Vietnamese wanted to get Johnson to the bargaining table. The Communist Party knew that the American people were growing tired of the war, with increasing protests against the war in the United States, and that if they continued to wear down the Americans, that they could win and bargain with Johnson. So like I said, from a military point of view, Tet is a win for the United States, but it turns out to be politically and psychologically a political and psychological defeat. And people are angry. Also, the U.S. people are angry. Johnson said that for years, presidents have been saying, we're going to win this war, we're going to win this war, and it doesn't look like we're winning this war at all. And so in March of 1968, if you go to the next slide, slide 11, you have the My Lai massacre. So on March 16th, 1968, it was Charlie Company, the 11th Brigade of the American Army 11th Brigade. They go into the South Vietnamese village of My Lai. My Lai had been a place where the Viet Cong were deeply entrenched, and numerous members of the Charlie Company had been maimed or killed in the area in the preceding weeks. And so American troops go into My Lai as a search and destroy mission. It soon degenerated into a massacre of about 300 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Army officer Calley, he ordered his men to go into the village firing, even though there had been no report of opposing fire. According to eyewitnesses, several old men were bayoneted, praying women and children were shot in the back of the head. At least one Vietnamese girl was raped and killed, probably many more. It said that American troops rounded a group of villagers and ordered them into a ditch and shot them all. Only one U.S. soldier ended up going to jail. And so the public finds out about the My Lai massacre in November of 1969, and they're pissed off. There's no Um, there's no way to tell who's the good guy in this situation, because right now the Americans are not the good guys anymore. This isn't like World War II, where that the Americans are going in and fighting for a noble cause. Instead, Americans are going in and massacring Vietnamese citizens. And America in the 1960s, if you go to slide 12, that's a picture that was in a magazine. Vietnam is the first war that's really being broadcast into people's homes. During World War II, you had newspaper accounts, but you didn't have a TV in every house, and you didn't have satellite images, and you didn't have the color photography that you had during the Vietnam War. And so everybody at home is seeing how horrible this war is. And Americans are seeing that war is not always patriotic, that war is not always a noble fight, and that war just flat out sucks. In March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson announces that he's not going to run for re-election for the presidency. He had a very successful domestic agenda. He was a great domestic president. The Vietnam War was a total crap show. and so Richard Nixon is elected president that fall. You also have Americans angry because with the civil rights movement that's been going on in the United States for African American equality, a group called the Congress of Racial Equality issues a report claiming that the U.S. military draft places, quote, a heavy discriminatory burden on minority groups and the poor, unquote. And so the group calls for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. And it's not just, and part of this is that it's not just that the U.S. is fighting this war, it's that who is fighting this war for the United States. You have a draft, but middle-class white boys in college are not going to Vietnam to fight. It's typically minorities and lower class who are fighting, who are being drafted to do this. Like I said, these college kids aren't going to war. It's the kids that aren't going to college. And so in 1968, Martin Luther King called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world and speaks out publicly against the Vietnam War, and later encourages even draft evasion and suggests that the anti-war forces and the civil rights groups actually merge because who is going in to fight this war becomes a civil rights issue. So Nixon's president, and in 1971, if you go to slide 14, the New York Times publishes the Pentagon Papers, which reveals decades of deception concerning U.S. policy in Vietnam on a part of the military and the executive branch. And it wasn't just one administration. It was the Truman, the Eisenhower, the Kennedy, the Johnson, and the Nixon administration, all kind of misleading the public on what is really going on in Vietnam, what the U.S. is really doing over there. And the Nixon administration, eager to stop the leak of what it considered sensitive information, appeals to the Supreme Court to halt the publication of the Pentagon Papers. The court decides in favor of the New York Times, citing the First Amendment. And basically, the whole world finds out that military leadership and the executive branch had been lying to Congress and the American public. It revealed that we were also involved in Laos and Cambodia. Supply route lines for the North Vietnamese ran through Laos and Cambodia, the most famous being the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we were bombing these supply routes. Lots of footpaths there were footpaths where weapons were being transferred from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. And so basically, this war was bigger than the American public knew about. So on slide 15, speaking of Cambodia, when Nixon took office, about 300 American soldiers a week were dying in Vietnam. And so Nixon creates this strategy, or during the Nixon administration, the strategy is created that, and he said he was going to bring troops home while increasing air raids over North Vietnam. And basically what he had done is approve a secret bombing campaign of North Vietnam and the allied Khmer Rouge, which were the communist regime in Cambodia. And we're going to hear more about the horribleness of the Khmer Rouge later. And basically, they were routing out communist sanctuaries and supply routes that helped North Vietnam that ran through Cambodia. So we're bombing Cambodia starting in April of 1970, and it sparks intense protests across the United States. The most notable protest, or most famous protest, being at Kent State University in Ohio. And on May 4th, 1970, a shooting of unarmed college students by the Ohio National Guard occurred after they were trying to break up an anti-war protest. Guardsmen fired about 67 rounds and killed 4 students, 2 of whom were just walking to class and not a part of the protests, and wounding 9 others, one of whom suffered permanent paralysis. And they were protesting. The protests were over the Cambodian campaign. Also in 1971, Nixon visits China, which is important to the overall Cold War, as the U.S. for the first time, is actively seeking to improve relations with a communist country. And it gained leverage for the United States in its Cold War battles with the Soviet Union. However, it really it troubled the North Vietnamese because President Nixon announces his intention, to establish relations with China, and Nixon's gesture towards China is seen by the North Vietnamese as an effort to create discord between themselves and their Chinese allies. China being a communist country, North Vietnam being a communist country, they're natural allies, and so the North Vietnamese see Nixon going to China as an effort to throw a wrench into that relationship. The next slide is difficult to look at, but it's a famous picture you've probably seen. It's about napalm attacks. Napalm is a mixture of a gelling agent and petroleum, or some sort of similar fuel that can be used for an incendiary device. And it was initially used against buildings, and then later is used against people because it sticks to the skin and causes severe burns when it's on fire. And it became an important part of the U.S. strategy during the Vietnam War. So this picture is from Trang Bang in South Vietnam. In June of 1972, South Vietnamese planes dropped a napalm bomb on Trang Bang, which had been occupied by the North Vietnamese. And the little girl who you see in the middle, she was 9 years old, and she was with a group of civilians that were fleeing the area to South Vietnamese held positions, and the South Vietnamese pilots saw these group of civilians running and mistook them for North Vietnamese soldiers and dropped a napalm bomb on them. And so she was badly burned and tore off her clothes. She ended up in a hospital in Saigon, where it was determined that her burns were so severe that they didn't think she would live. She was in the hospital for 14 months and had 17 surgeries, and she did survive, and she later studied in Cuba and became a Canadian citizen. So those are just some pictures. So we see pictures of the horrors of war, on both sides, and some of these images have been difficult or difficult to look at. But this was a particularly horrible war, as all wars are horrible. So in slide 17, the Paris Peace Conference in 1973, the North Vietnam is beaten down. The Americans are beaten down. And they just want it to go away. And so in January 1973, the Nixon White House convinces the South Vietnamese regime in Saigon that if they go into a peace accord, that America will not abandon them. So on January 23rd, 1973, the final draft was initiated, ending open hostilities between the United States and North Vietnam. And then August of 1974, Nixon resigns because of the Watergate scandal. So the Paris, even though the U.S. started to withdraw troops and hostilities are going down, the Paris Peace Agreement does not end the conflict in Vietnam. You still have, at the time of the Paris Peace Accord, you still have Vietnam was partitioned along the 17th parallel. And South Vietnamese forces, without much aid from the Americans, continue to battle communist forces. So in March of 1973, South Vietnamese forces are still trying to save the South from political and military collapse. On April 30th, 1975, at this time Gerald Ford is president, communist forces enter the presidential palace in Saigon, South Vietnam, and take over. They rename the city, they rename Saigon Ho Chi Minh City in honor of Ho Chi Minh, and anticipating the fall of Saigon. Gerald Ford announces that as far as the U.S. is concerned, the Vietnam War is finished. If you go to the final slide, it's just some conclusions about the Vietnam War. And I know this is you can't cover the Vietnam War in 40 minutes. But all in all, the big takeaways is that this is the first war that the United States loses. I mean, we just lost. South Vietnam fell to the communists. We did not achieve our mission, our goal. It also hurts the U.S.'s global credibility. The Pentagon Papers, misleading the American public, but also it disproved the domino theory. Just because we lost the war in Vietnam, the rest of Asia did not fall to communism. Ultimately, it's said between 1 to 3 million Vietnamese died, although as an estimate, we'll never really know how many Vietnamese died. 58,000 U.S. troops were killed, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotian citizens were killed. 6 U.S. presidents involved in this, from Truman all the way up to Ford. Ho Chi Minh dies in 1969, and so that's when they named Ho Chi Minh. So in 1975, Ho Chi Minh City is named in his honor. So that's about it. I do encourage you to go onto the links on the PowerPoint and take a look at, read a little bit more about this, because like I said, you can't do the Vietnam War in 40 minutes, but we're giving it a shot. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'm going to try and get everything up by tonight. It won't be due until Sunday, so you got through the weekend to get everything done. So, if you have any questions, let me know. We'll talk to you later. Bye.